Hi everybody, this is Agnes from Sediment, and today let's explore and taste some great alternatives to Brunello di Montalcino. But before we start discussing great alternatives of Brunello di Montalcino, we should first take a closer look at this Tuscan wine made from one of Italy's greatest red grape varieties, Sangiovese. What is about Brunello wine so unique and keeps us coming back for this style? Brunello di Montalcino is one of the most famous appellations in Tuscany, despite the fact that it is certainly not the region's most historic one. It is located around the town of Montalcino in southern Tuscany. Brunello is the local synonym for Sangiovese, and Sangiovese has a very unique character, which we will discuss in a minute, but one of its highly praised qualities is its ability to express terroir. Hence the huge differences between Brunello di Montalcino and other appellations and regions this grape is grown. As a grape variety, Sangiovese does not produce deeply colored, inky wines, one of many reasons why we shouldn't judge wine simply by its appearance. Its flavor profile is usually dominated by fresh red berries. Think of sour cherries, strawberries, and wild raspberries. These very delicate, bright fruit flavors can easily be overpowered, which is why so many wine professionals grudge when Sangiovese is blended with other grape varieties that have strong character, such as Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot. On the palate, Sangiovese is always marked by high, juicy acidity. The best examples resemble of biting into that sour cherry, and it tends to deliver elevated levels of firm, sandy tannins. As I mentioned before, where Sangiovese is grown will significantly impact the wine's style. Montalcino is more open and warmer than, for example, Chianti Classico, resulting in wines with a riper fruit profile, a richer and fuller body, and oftentimes higher alcohol than Chianti Classico. I have also noticed that despite the fact that Brunello di Montalcino is made from 100% Sangiovese, it tends to be deeper in color than Chianti Classicos, where Sangiovese can be blended with other grape varieties, many of which increase color intensity. Lastly, we cannot dismiss the role of winemaking. Brunello di Montalcino has one of the longest minimum aging requirements, which is 5 years, of which 2 must be in oak. So naturally, these wines enter the market relatively mature with significant complexity and development. Because of that, it is, to my knowledge, the only appellation that allows the addition of younger wines, not older, as it often is the case elsewhere. Now, commonly, the choice of oak is in the shape of large, old Slavonian barrels, so the wines don't typically show particularly intense new oak aromas. Instead, the aging shapes the flavors through development, introducing notes of balsamic, dried meat, and leather, while also potentially resolving the tannin texture. So now that we understand the appeal of Brunello di Montalcino better, we can start to explore the alternatives. But before we actually do that, let's taste Brunello itself first, so we have a clear benchmark in the glass before we compare it to anything else. Okay, so I have in my glass 2020 Brunello di Montalcino from Altesino estate. We have been visiting the estate. I think Altesino has been on my YouTube channel for several times, so let's taste the wine. You know, we discussed the wine before, the general Brunello di Montalcino wine style, and when I smelled this wine, the immediate first impression that I had was that smoked cherry element. So we have these smoked red cherries, we have hints of baked raspberries, strawberries, so there is a bit of caramelization of that fruit here felt. It is in no way sweet tasting or sweet, sugary in a way, but we have that depth and maybe slightly crushed fruit character, maybe slightly oxidized and dried fruit character to it. We also have a lot of spiciness. I think, these classic Mediterranean herbs are here present. All right, I did not mention the color, which we did discuss in quite a detail. So you will see that this wine is relatively maybe deeper in color than other wines, than Pinot Noir, for example, but in no way is this inky. And we have significant garnet color. Sangiovese similarly as Nebbiolo rarely shows that, bluish element even when it's young. Okay, let's taste the wine. One thing that I did not mention, those tannins, they just pulled my mouth together and I lost words. It is the first wine today, so it just pushed it and it kicked. One thing that I missed in the introduction is how really sweet fruit flavors dominated Brunello usually is, at least for my palate. There is almost not a hint of austerity. There is almost not a hint of shy and unripe fruit flavors, never. And it just burst with these really ultra ripe, open, crushed, all kinds of red berries, and this might be one of the reasons why we love and enjoy this wine style so much. I do have that elevated acidity in this wine, and of course we have that, chalky, that really firm tannin texture, that generosity of the fruit that we have in this wine. It almost needs, that acidity and that tannin just to, put it in some sort of form and some sort of ruling, otherwise it would just all be fruit that is overflowing the bowl. I don't know. Now it starts to feel, like those cherries that you dip in that really sweet aged balsamic. There's some smokiness to it. I have mentioned that several times. That very beautiful first sip, of those crushed, slightly oxidized, maybe slightly cooked fruit characters. It is just beautiful, beautiful wine. I will give this wine 92 points. Shall we continue to the first alternative? The first, and dare I say, very logical alternative to Brunello di Montalcino is Vino Nobile di Montepulciano. With Montepulciano, we are talking about the same grape variety. Yes, other grape varieties are allowed, but many producers bottle 100% Sangiovese. The appellation actually is located quite close to Montalcino and sits slightly further inland, further away from the sea, but it still enjoys similar climate, just with less maritime influence. It is a smaller appellation than Montalcino, yet in many cases it offers better value. One reason for that could be that Vino Nobile di Montepulciano wines do not require the same minimum aging as wines labeled Brunello. That could also suggest that wines might be fresher and brighter fruit-driven upon their release. However, that does not mean that they lack the potential to develop the same kind of flavor complexity as they age. Overall, I think that in blind tasting, I would struggle to identify between these two appellations, especially if I'm having a top producer from Montepulciano. In theory, I would expect slightly different tannin texture, with Vino Nobile showing more rustic, coarser tannin, and most likely a body that is not quite as rich and full as Brunello. Alright, now that I have Vino Nobile di Montepulciano in my glass from one of the top producers, Avignonesi, let's discuss it. Right from the start, I can tell you, it shows so much brighter, fresher fruit character. We had all kinds of, leather and earthiness, and dried cherry character in the Brunello. And this one is 2022 vintage, so it is much younger. So it's 2 years younger. And naturally, we have that brightness, that slight crunchiness of the fruit. But not at all are we sacrificing, the complexity in the wine, because I do feel somewhere there in the background those Mediterranean herbs, and now they are not savory, they are not, dried or fermented. Now they are more, freshly from the bush. You have some florals even. There is more nerviness to this wine than we had for Brunello. Let's taste the wine. So the first sip of this wine is definitely not as rich, as powerful, as full-bodied. I would say that this specific example even has a lightness, it has very light feet. It has that delicacy, that elegance to it. As with Brunello, we had both feet on the ground, standing strong and powerful. Here we have, you kind of feel a bit of power there, but it is in a very elegant way, represented and expressed. I have really beautiful, juicy type of acidity, and I have tannin, and this is so interesting. Avignonesi, one of the top producers within the Montepulciano area, and yet I do feel that rusticity to the tannin, or maybe it is because of all the books I have read, and now that is all that I believe, but there is a bit, grippier texture to it. It is not as ripe, and that could actually be due to the fact that Vino Nobile di Montepulciano is not aged as long before it is released, because with longer aging, tannins tend to polymerize and create these longer chains so they feel softer on the palate. So maybe that is one of the reasons why we sometimes think of Vino Nobile having, a bit grippier tannin texture. I think we have that similar fruit sweetness here as well that we had with Brunello, but it is fresher, it is juicier, there's more acidity almost to it. There is more crunch to the fruit. I will give this wine 93 points. Let's move to the next alternative. The next great alternative for me would be Rioja Reserva or Rioja Gran Reserva. I think both of these categories can show a similar flavor profile, especially when Rioja wines are made focused on Tempranillo, harvested from higher elevation vineyards, which might lead to firmer tannin texture and higher acidity overall. However, I do want to point out that classic red Rioja rarely ever reaches the same levels of high tannins and acidity as Brunello. For me, Rioja does not have the same power and concentration, but the flavor profile can be quite similar, showing notes of fresh red berries like strawberries and cherries. I am focusing on Rioja Reserva and Gran Reserva because élevage can introduce notes of toastiness, leather, and balsamic. And as you might remember, Brunello has one of the longest aging requirements, therefore it reaches the market with already significant complexity and development. So it only felt natural to look for wine that can deliver the same flavor depth. Also, both regions typically do not rely on new oak barrels, so do not expect expressive vanilla or coconut from either of these appellations. Alright, let's continue with the tasting, and we have 2021 Muga Rioja Reserva, and it does have deeper color than we would expect from Sangiovese. So if you are tasting it in blind, the color might be one of the indicators. We have to be completely honest though here, because we have some additions of Graciano and Mazzuelo here as well, which could add a deeper color to the wine. I was not expecting Rioja to have such a similar aroma to what I had in Brunello wine. We do have similar red berries. We have strawberries, raspberries, crushed cherries. The cherries might not necessarily be those sour cherries. They're much sweeter here on the nose, but character overall is very similar. There is more to this wine. There's more vibrancy maybe, more freshness. So, in a way, this nose represents something between the Vino Nobile and Brunello that we had. And somehow I feel more oak presence. I feel that spiciness, that toastiness way more than I felt it in the Brunello wines. We are absolutely sure that Brunello is and must be aged in oak barrels, but it was development of the fruit that rather shaped the flavors here. I'm not sure if this has seen at all any new oak, maybe second or third fill. But anyway, it is present on the nose. It is well integrated and beautifully balanced with fruit dough, so let's move to the tasting. Similarly, as with Brunello wine, I had that first grip of sweet, really ripe, cherries and strawberries, that really beautiful plum, maybe slightly dried plum skin, And the tannin texture is so beautifully managed in this wine. It's chalky, but it is definitely not as high, not as firm, not as defining as we had in wine 1 and 2, the Brunello and Vino Nobile respectively. Surprisingly, this wine has that really elevated, beautiful, juicy acidity. In a way, it adds almost more freshness to the wine than maybe I had in Brunello, but I think it could be due to the fact that the fruit is also brighter, that the fruit is, juicier, and the acidity doesn't need to cut through so much depth and flesh and texture, so it does feel more prominent here with this wine. I think it is absolutely beautiful, beautiful bottle. I will give this wine 93 points. Let's move to the next alternative. Now, Provence reds might initially sound like a really broad category. And while it is true that the majority of Provence region is dedicated to production of rosé wines and red wines make up only a very small proportion, it is still a very versatile wine style. You might see more new wood here, but many top producers still work with old neutral barrels that contribute more structure rather than flavor. The dominant grape varieties can vary a lot. You might see Cabernet Sauvignon, Syrah, and of course Grenache. But I would like to focus on reds, where Mourvèdre grape variety makes up the majority of the blend. Like Sangiovese, Mourvèdre develops high levels of tannin, although they tend to be more powerful and coarser in character. And like Sangiovese, it shows elevated levels of acidity, which helps to refreshen the full body and rich texture of the wine. The savory depth that we enjoy so much in our Brunellos can also be beautifully expressed in Provence reds, often reminding notes of black olives and Earl Grey, accompanied by savory Mediterranean herbs and garrigue. Furthermore, Mourvèdre can also develop distinctly gamey and leathery notes. In blind tastings, it might be easier to tell these two styles apart simply because Mourvèdre-based wines have that deep, inky color which Sangiovese just is not capable of. Alright, we are with Chateau Romanin, and as with Provence reds, it is a blend. It is a blend of Mourvèdre, Syrah, Grenache, and Cabernet Sauvignon, I think, in this specific case. I have also chosen a wine that could represent, in a way, style that is more closer to the Brunello, and we have 2016 vintage. So of course I was looking for wines that have some bottle age at least. We do have deeper color, but because of 2016 vintage, because this wine is at least 10 years old, we already have some of that garnet, some of that brick character to it, which similarly we saw in the Brunello wine. And on the nose, it's so beautiful, it's so inviting. I have that gamey character, I have that dumb black earth, I have autumn leaves and that leather. I almost feel that note of horse saddle, but sometimes these aromas we associate with Brettanomyces, but in no way I feel Brett here. It is very beautiful, just you have all that ripe, juicy fruit character, maybe slightly baked in a way, but also you have those earthy flavors, and you know me, I love my wine with a lot of earthy flavors, and this just shows such an intense and beautiful and very complex nose. I have these savory Mediterranean herbs. I do have sage, fermented sage, rosemary and thyme. And it is all mixed with these beautiful, almost like chamomile and linden flowers. Like you have this power in a way, but you also have those really delicate, spring blossom. How is that possible? And of course, the fruit character here is deeply colored. We have more blue and black berries rather than red berries, but the ripe strawberry and cherry character is still here. Let's taste it. So similarly as with Brunello at the very beginning, the very first sip was filled with these ripe, sweet fruit flavors. I love it. Thank you for that. But once you swallow the wine or spit the wine out, the texture comes, the texture enters the room. And while I'm talking with you, it is still the texture that I feel. It is slightly like you are chewing on that, sage or on that rosemary. It adds a bit of grip, but somewhere there, in that tannin frame, you have fruit hidden. We also have slightly elevated alcohol level. This is something that I felt. I maybe felt it a little bit in the Brunello when we first tasted it, but it was my first wine, so I was not trying to really pay too much attention to it. But here in this wine, there was slight warmth, on the palate when we tasted it. But overall, the fruit covers it beautifully. The texture and the body and the power covers it beautifully. I will give this wine 94 points. It is amazing. Let's move to the last alternative of Brunello wine. Now, here the focus is really more towards aged wines. Bordeaux is released relatively early in its life, when it is full of energy and packed with intense fresh red and blue fruit flavors. But for someone who enjoys the depth and complexity of Brunello, more mature bottles of Bordeaux often makes more sense, especially once the wines start to show those earthy hints, that autumn leaf character and tobacco. I also think that both wines can be very similar in terms of body structure, offering full and rich wines. However, right bank Bordeaux usually shows a lower acidity, still fresh and lively, but certainly not as nervy. As mentioned, Sangiovese tends to have really high levels of tannin and similar texture we can expect from Merlot-based wine. That said, the tannins often feel differently grained on the palate, somewhat finer and tighter, which can give an impression of more smoother character. We usually expect Bordeaux to be aged at least partially in new oak barrels. And there are excellent examples that offer great oak integration, adding slight edge of flavor complexity. However, many producers are also experimenting with concrete and amphora, so similarly as in Brunello, oak does not need to be the prominent feature. In blind tastings though, similarly as with Provence reds, these styles may be harder to confuse simply because Merlot-based wines tend to be deeper in color. And that kind of deep color is rarely seen in classic Brunello di Montalcino wines. So let's taste it. So today we have Chateau 2018 vintage from Castillon. Castillon is like a satellite appellation of Saint-Emilion, and we often refer to Castillon as offering these really high top quality wines at a fraction of price of that of Saint-Emilion. So a lot of wine professionals are now looking around these better known appellations, when they want to look for value. And we have 2018 vintage. As I told you, we are looking for wines that have a bit of maturity. Bordeaux is one of those rare wines or rare appellations or rare regions where it always lies to you in the glass. It always seems younger than it is. So feel free to take or choose even older vintages because, when it is a blind tasting, I always add extra 5 years to what I think this wine might be. We'll see if this is the case here as well with 2018 vintage. So this is how it looks color-wise. So of course we are in much deeper color. And on the nose, to be honest, this wine is the most distinctive from all the crowd. I would want to say that in the blind tasting, I would immediately want to go to Bordeaux. It has that Bordeaux soul. It has that Bordeaux character. So we have blueberries and blackberries, and we have blackcurrant and that hint of blackcurrant leaf as well. Some of that toasty, that cedarwood, maybe cigar box kind of character that's so typical and something that I usually associate with Bordeaux so much. And I will say, I think it is still very youthful. It is still very bright in its fruit. Let's taste it. Yes, I think it definitely offers that really beautiful alternative to Brunello, but it unmistakably remains a Bordeaux. We do have that beautiful mid-palate, ripe fruit flavored palate, and we have really polished, almost smooth tannin, but the grip is there, elevated tannins are here. And the acidity is really refreshing and lively, and it adds, life to this wine. But it remains really fresh and bright and definitely stands out amongst all these wines here that we have tasted. I think it needs another solid 5 years, just a little bit start to resemble that development of Brunello, with balsamic, with that leather-like aromas, because it is still very youngish, very fresh style wine. Yes, I almost feel like for it to deliver that perfect alternative, we have to wait for some gray hair to appear here in this wine. And it is just too youthful here. But I think the structure-wise, the body-wise, the tannin-wise, and also the acidity, it is very similar to what Brunello was expressing in the glass here. I will give this wine 91 points. It's a great example from where it's coming from. I will be honest, I do think that Brunello di Montalcino in a way represents that unmistakable European soul. As I mentioned before, there are not many winemaking regions that require such long aging before a wine is released, so it felt natural to stay in Europe when looking for alternatives. Wine regions from Americas and Oceania often offer much brighter, sometimes even crystalline fruit flavors that we rarely find in Brunello wines. That said, I did consider classic Pinotage from South Africa, and I was specifically looking for some, but unfortunately none was available in my small market. And I know that many of you who study wine might want to comment that I have forgotten one of Sangiovese's laterals, Nebbiolo. It is absolutely true, they share a similar texture, body and acidity, and that significant grip from elevated levels of tannin. But I wanted to look beyond the usual suspects and for the most part step outside of Italy. Let me know in the comment section below what other great alternatives there are for Brunello di Montalcino wines and to which wines I should be exploring alternatives to next. And please stay on No Sediment channel by clicking here.